Hey there. I'm Matthew Sheffield. Thanks for joining me today. It's been a little while. I've had some family and medical issues, so I apologize for the delay in the content posting, but I've effectively been living in a COVID cave for a month, and it was no fun, I'll tell you that. But yeah, anyway, I'm slowly getting back into things, so we're back live with the Theory of Change shows, and I thank you for being here today. So today we're going to be talking about the way we're going to be starting a new arc on the program about how change happens from the left in political structures in countries across the globe and in different demographic groups and how they're developing. And so for that topic, I wanted to get that started with Luke Savage. He is the author of a new book called The Dead Center, and he's also a columnist at Jacobin magazine. So thanks for being here today, Luke.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let me just put up a graphic of your book there. So it's called The Dead Center. After the end of history is your end subtitle, but the full title is Reflections on Liberalism and Democracy After the End of History. So there's a lot of words in the title there, but I want to discuss each aspect of that. So first of all, this is a collection of writings that you've done, or columns and articles for Jacobin magazine over the years. And so, but your overall thesis, you're trying to organize it as in a thematic sense, looking at a larger argument. And so, and then that focuses on the dead center. What do you mean by the dead center?
The dead center, I suppose, refers to a number of things, but broadly speaking, the dead center is the political consensus that we've been living in, globally, but especially in the West, and even more especially in the kind of Anglo-American West. So in Britain and North America, I think quite acutely. It's the consensus we've been stuck with since roughly the early 1990s, which was a very significant and formative period in global history. I think in some ways quite unique period in global history where liberals, broadly defined, and also in European context, people who'd called themselves social democrats or even socialists, in many cases, essentially capitulated to the zeitgeist of the 1990s, to this kind of world of unfettered markets, hyper-financialization, deregulation, range of kind of means-tested social policies and things like that. And there's a lot of different things we could discuss in relation to all of that. But I think as far as the title and the theme of my book is concerned, the most important thing about that moment was that it really discarded a broad notion of progress, which people had held in one way or another. I mean, strongly at different points in the 20th century, but really going back, running throughout the modern age. There were a variety of beliefs, broad currents of belief that the future could be something better than the present, qualitatively different and transcendent of the problems and injustices found in the present. Something that's unique, I think, in many ways about the 1990s, which is contained in things like the phrase "the end of history," was the idea that this world we have now is as far as it goes. We've reached, this is the end of the rainbow. There's nothing beyond or outside of this. And I think that even in a world, just to finish my thought here, even in a world where we've had this consensus we live in has been disrupted and upset now many times by many different things, and yet we're still very much living in a sort of undead version of it. So that's the dead center in the kind of broad sense as construed in my book.
Yeah, and for those who hadn't heard the phrase, like the end of history, it was the literal title of a book. It basically that book by this guy named Francis Fukuyama sort of became almost the Bible of the global emerging neoliberal corporatist consensus after it came out in the early 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union. And so, but it's weird though that as much as that book was adopted wholesale by centrists or you could call them conservatives, frankly, I think you should, that people on the left didn't really respond to it as much, not nearly as much. And it just sort of took everything by storm in universities. And I mean, do you want to talk about that a little bit? Or is that, I don't know if that's too far afield from what your.
Well, I do think it's relevant, actually. I mean, so I've been engaged with and involved in the political left in one way or another since I was a teenager. And when I was a teenager in the early 2000s, the left really was very different from the left as it exists now. And I would argue that actually the left was bludgeoned pretty hard by neoliberal corporatism in the 80s and 90s, and not just the institutions of the left. So there were all kinds of obvious ways in that happened, trade unions being, battered and things like that. But also in a kind of deeper and in some ways more insidious kind of ideological sense. I think, when I entered the political left, it was a pretty sad place, really. And it wasn't a place, I mean, people might still have talked, they might have referred to kind of horizons beyond the world we lived in, but I don't think most people really believed in them. It really was about grappling with the world as it was and just trying to make it a little bit less, inhumane and that kind of thing. I think, in the past, kind of 5, 6, 7 years, there's been really a quite inspiring attempt to push beyond that. And it's one of the reasons why the political left today is much more vibrant and dynamic than I think it was, 20 years ago.
Yeah, well, and it was, I mean, ultimately you had this idea that set in that this is as good as it gets. And that we can't expect more. We shouldn't expect more. And of course, but the problem is, like, if that's the sentiment that is dominating the political left, well, then it's not actually on the political left. That's a fundamentally conservative set. Because, I mean, ultimately, I think the other thing is that people's political compasses got miscalibrated after the fall of the Soviet Union, in that so conservatism of, let's say, the Edmund Burke type variety or English Canadian conservatism is actually kind of, their ballast, if you will, like their center of gravity is kind of let's just keep things how they currently are. We don't need to do other stuff. We don't need to be reactionary. We don't need to be, more socially democratic. Let's just keep things how they are. And so, like, that's in some cases, like a non-ideological, conservative, moderate type centrist attitude. And that attitude and people with those beliefs basically kind of took over the political left in a lot of countries in the United States. And then effectively what that meant is it created this vast room for reaction on the right, and which did not really exist outside of the United States, I would say. And I mean, you're a Canadian, though. You tell me.
I mean, we have our fair share of reactionaries up here as well. Although, really the sort of new right, in the 90s in Canada it was very heavily influenced by the American right.
Oh yeah.
So it's one of America's many exports.
We weren't sending our best people, to paraphrase Donald Trump. But yeah, so at the same time, though, I would say, though, that it is important. So a lot of Americans know nothing about Canada really, or Canadian politics. And meanwhile, basically every Canadian follows American politics, and in many cases knows more about American politics than Americans, a lot of Americans. And so, but the thing is that it's important, I think, for Americans, especially if you're on the political left, to pay attention to the way that politics in other countries works, because the American political center is much further to the right compared to everybody else. And there's a lot of things that can be learned from that. That even, the furthest, any right-wing party in UK or France or, I mean, you name it, Japan, like, they're not going after those countries' universal healthcare solutions. They're just not. And it's interesting to think about why. And I mean, let's talk about that a bit.
Sure. I think Canada there are a lot of lessons that Canada has to teach liberals in the United States. A lot of lessons it teaches us about the modern kind of liberal affect in general, or the centrist one, if you prefer. I mean, when it comes to something like universal health care, I mean, I think there was a tendency, or there has been a tendency for Democrats in the United States to dismiss universal health care as kind of an impossible dream, something like that, as something that is not popular. We heard a lot. Polling has never suggested, to my knowledge, never suggested that universal health care polls very well, particularly among Democrats. So that's one version of the argument you hear against it from American liberals, right? That it's kind of unfeasible, unpopular. There's also a second, and I think more ideological argument, which is actually just that it's bad, right? During the Democratic primaries in 2020, a talking point you heard over and over again was that universal health care effectively meant taking away people's private plans, right? So it was actually a sort of active government theft, which is talking point really with its roots on the right. I mean, if you go back and you listen to Ronald Reagan's famous screed against socialized medicine, it was released on vinyl, I think, by the American Medical Association in the 1960s. It's very much what he says as well. So, Canada is an instructive case because, as are, I think, other countries, Britain, has built a kind of whole civic religion almost out of the National Health Service. And as you said, there's not a lot of appetite even on the right to privatize these systems. It's very difficult even for politicians to make cuts to them, although of course they do. I mean, any attacks on universal health care typically have to happen sort of by stealth. And one of the reasons for that is that universal health care is incredibly popular. People like the experience of it. When you create a universal program like universal health care, you're also, in effect, creating a large and highly motivated constituency that's going to defend that program, which is, when you look at a lot of the social policy that's on offer from Democrats and has been for some time, particularly since the 1990s, there's an obsession with means testing, right? There's an obsession with not having universality, but with having these kind of piecemeal reforms that are supposed to be more targeted. And there are all kinds of other problems with those. I think, generally speaking, except in a few cases, means testing is not a good way to make public policy. But politically, when you do you do pass means tested reforms, they're very easily undone because you don't have the same highly motivated constituency to defend them. So that's one thing. But there's another lesson about Canada that is the subject of an essay in my book, and I think this is probably the most interesting point about Canada as far as Americans are concerned, anyway. In the United States, a refrain you will hear over and over again from Democrats is that and liberals in general, is that the main obstacle to progressive reforms is opposition from the right. It's political gridlock. It's a political right that doesn't want to do business. The Republican Party doesn't want to help Democrats pass reforms. There are other arguments, some of which have a basis in fact, like the fact that America's political system is quite obstructive. At the federal level, it's quite has a preference towards kind of minority power. Democrats often have tens of millions of more votes in the Senate than the GOP, and will barely have a majority, or in some cases will have a minority. So all of those are real constraints. This is why Canada is very useful to look at, because in Canada we have a Westminster parliamentary system modeled on the British version. You can win a majority government with as little as kind of 35% of the popular vote if the votes are distributed. It's a first past the post system, so if the votes are distributed geographically in the right way, you can win a pretty big majority. There are two chambers in Canada. There is a Senate. The Senate doesn't have a lot of legitimacy. It's an appointed chamber. And so, basically, if you form a federal government in Canada, the constraints on passing progressive reforms are extremely minimal as compared to somewhere like the United States. In 2015, the Trudeau Liberals came to power, and they had an agenda which I don't think, a program, a platform that was, I think, quite overrated in some ways, but did have a lot of reforms that people found attractive and wanted to see happen. And for the most part, we didn't even really get those. There's and one other thing I forgot to mention is the campaign finance system in Canada also much more tightly regulated. So if you pursue an agenda that rubs the billionaire class or something the wrong way, it's very difficult for them to pour money into your opponents or something like that. So again, the constraints for action on a government in Canada are much lesser. And what we see again and again is that even when all kinds of things are popular, sweeping environmental reform is popular. Taxes on the rich are popular. Redistributive programs are popular. Extending Canadian healthcare to cover things it doesn't cover, like vision, dental, pharmaceutical. These huge gaps in our system, which was created decades ago. Even when it would be popular for a self-described progressive government to do those things, they don't by and large. And I think that's a really important and obstructive, because what it tells instructive rather, because what it tells you is that by and large, a lot of the things that an institution like the Democratic Party is nominally committed to, will only remain committed to those things provided that there's no chance of them actually being passed. And if there is a chance of them being passed, you'll actually find them ideologically opposed to them. And in fact, we don't even have to look at Canada to see evidence of that, because there are something like 13 states, I may be getting the number wrong, where that are solidly blue, where Democrats have super majorities, and this is mostly not how they govern. I mean, Andrew Cuomo, in a solidly blue state, formed a special caucus so that he could pass Republican budgets in solidly blue New York. So there are some wider lessons here, I think, about what self-described progressive liberals are actually committed to, and what their own beliefs and agenda actually is, as distinct from their rhetoric.
Yeah, well, and it's important to note that for people, people who are labeled as on the left, they actually want the system that presently exists. A lot of them do, especially at the highest levels. And that's why. And I guess another thing that you do talk about to that end, and this is more of an affliction in the United States, but like this idea of bipartisanship, that the notion that you have to do it, and it seems to be fading away after the Republican Party, got hostilely taken over by Donald Trump. But like that was for the longest time the rationale used as the excuse for, well, this is why we can't do things that people want. Well, because we have to have bipartisan support. Okay, well now you don't have to. Well, now we have the filibuster, and it's like, yeah. And so your point is a very good one, but it does also though speak to the need for people who are on the political left to be doing more institutional building and doing more explaining of their ideas. So, like, for instance, I heard from a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters, like they would. So, in other words, Americans support. They support, some form of universal health care coverage, in many cases, like actually support single payer. But at the same time, because people who are supporters of it don't explain it very well. So, like you mentioned, the idea of, well, this is going to take away your private insurance. Like it actually would do that, like, but you would get something better in exchange for that. So, but instead of trying to fashion policy ideas that sort of ramp up to it, in other words, make it opt in and get people to opt in and see how great it is, who can't afford it, and then gradually, go in from there, and that's how you do it. People are like, no, I just want to have it immediately. I want to see who's on the record for this and all, and like, you don't gain anything by doing that. And I feel like
I mean, I
haven't
think,
figured that out.
I think advocacy for universal health care, I think the means to that advocacy, I think, can change depending on the context. So I think that during the Democratic primaries, when Sanders was running for president, both times, both in 2016 and 2020, I think there was a lot of utility, and it was very defensible for him to advocate the sort of maximalist position, because he was doing it in kind of deep moral terms. He was trying to advance not only a policy item, but also a deeper idea of healthcare that is removed from the market entirely, which, as you said, as you've alluded to, is, I think, an idea that's alien to a lot of Americans in particular, because if you've never experienced a decommodified version of something, it's very difficult to
it doesn't
imagine
seem
it.
Possible. Yeah.
Right. And conversely, if you have experienced a decommodified version of something like healthcare, the idea of, like, flashing a credit card at a doctor's office or something is very strange and very alien. In terms of how how universal healthcare, how you actually get there and stuff like that. I mean, outside the context of a primary where you have this huge soapbox to do political education to kind of mount this argument, I mean, I think it gets much more difficult. I mean, advocating for it in the present context is a little more difficult. And of course, yeah, it's not just a question of holding a vote to get people on record and see where the chips fall. I mean, up ahead of the 2020 Democratic primaries, there were lots of thoroughly centrist Democrats who support. I mean, Kamala Harris and Cory Booker are two that come to mind, who I think both co-sponsored Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All bill, and neither of them, when they actually were running for president, offered anything like it, because for various reasons. But yeah, so that's my point. That's my point there again. And I think for that reason, at least much of the time, it is actually a very good idea to kind of advocate for the aside, putting the question aside of, strategically speaking, how you actually get how you get to something like socialized medicine in a political climate as obstructive as the United States is. I do think that advocating the sort of maximalist position probably does help create a it probably helps educate a lot of people about what's actually being proposed, and also probably does to some degree help separate a figure like Sanders, who believes quite fiercely in the idea of universal healthcare as a public good, from others who may kind of claim to support universality but don't.
Yeah. Well, I guess the other thing is that you need people who are doing more than that. Like, you need more than just a maximalist approach. You need, like, multiple people making multiple arguments because that will, each argument works for different people. So, like, in other words, if you look at the American political right, you've got some people out there who are saying, well, we need to give corporate welfare to billionaires because they're the job creators. Then you've got other people who make the argument, well, we need to do this because they are our moral betters. And Ayn Rand is right about, worthless scum moochers. And then you've got other people that are like, well, no, we need to give the billionaires what they want because they will save us from the brown people coming to this country. And like, they've got this, a bunch of people all arguing for the same policies, but with different angles. And in the political left in the United States, I just don't see that very much. And I feel like there should be. And, instead, what you see, and you wrote about this in your book also, which it was one of my favorite columns in there about, you call it how liberals fell in love with the West Wing, the former ABC TV show. And it's funny because I hadn't read that column before, but basically I call it Sorkin Syndrome. This idea that, well, if you just give us good enough speech, if you just tell people the truth, then they'll come, then they'll come around and be persuaded, even though they hate you and everything you stand for. The bad guys can come through and turn it around. And it's like, no, they can't. And they won't.
Yeah, I mean, the West Wing is, in some ways, it's kind of, I'm like bashful about continuing to talk about it because it really is strange to be talking about a television show that's been off the air since I think it's 2007. But when I wrote that essay, which was published in Current Affairs back in 2017 about the show, I think even then I underestimated the influence of the West Wing and of Aaron Sorkin in general, but especially of that show. I mean, when you read the memoirs of former Obama White House staffers who talk about how formative it was watching that show for them, it's clear that the West Wing is actually it's actually been some people's political education. I think actually Jen Psaki just referred to it in a press conference not that long ago. It has a huge international fandom. It's a very popular show, and it's a show which articulates a lot of the things that liberals, particularly through the Clinton and Obama eras, have believed. I mean, it's a theory of, if you want, a theory of political change without really any change to it. It's a style of articulates a style of politics where, as you said, you have a smart, cerebral president. President Bartlett, he has a Nobel Prize in economics. He's a former governor of New Hampshire. He's really smart. He's really handsome, and he gets up there and he gives these incredible speeches, and the speeches kind of bring people together. They transcend cultural and political divides. But if you look closely at that show, it's pretty striking. I mean, it is in some ways the most unconstrained liberal fantasy of politics that you could imagine, and they don't change American society in any significant way at all. In fact, when they do have quote unquote achievements, they're things like cutting Social Security and things like that, which they do in a bipartisan way in a sort of backroom setting in an episode that is supposed to be example of like nobility triumph, political nobility and honor triumphing over partisanship or something. And so the show I think really captured something that reached its kind of peak during the Obama era, which was this celebration of bipartisanship, this kind of liberalism without a transformative agenda of its own of any kind. So a liberalism without any kind of great society or New Deal or some kind of a political imagination capable of accommodating those things. And there are these great speeches, but they're not really there's speeches that are not, I suppose, to go back to what you were saying, they are maximalist in a sense, in that they are the epitome of what a liberal audience craves, but they're not maximalist in an ideological sense. I mean, they're not, you don't see President Bartlett doesn't advocate for universal health care. He doesn't take kind of these hard and fast positions like healthcare is a right, not a privilege, and neither did Obama. Obama was not a fan of those kinds of things. He saw that way of thinking as, I think, quite dogmatic in some ways, and of course, I don't think he doesn't believe in universality and something like healthcare anyway. But I could talk about the West Wing for forever and ever, but in so many ways, I think it really is the ultimate kind of Rosetta Stone for decoding kind of a whole host of the ways in which American liberals in particular have increasingly thought about politics and also their role within it.
Yeah. Well, and I'd say you add the West Wing plus Francis Fukuyama plus that out of context quote from Martin Luther King about the moral arc of the universe bends inevitably toward justice.
That's right.
Basically, you've got this idea that, well, we're all going to have equality and nice things someday, but it will just happen on its own. And you saw that in terms of even their political strategy during the Obama years. So there was this book that came out that was called The Emerging Democratic Majority. And that book, the actual book itself said that as non-religious people increase, as Hispanics and Asians increase, if the Democrats can continue to hold on to their existing coalition by continuing to serve it, then they will become a majority party. But it's like the entire Democratic and liberal commentariat and the Democratic political class took off the first part of the book, which was, well, you have this current constituency and you have to continue serving them. Like that was literally one of the most integral pieces of the book. And they just sort of lopped it off. And it's like, oh, look, we don't have to do anything. We're going to win. Isn't that going to be magical? And you had all these ridiculous articles to that effect.
I mean, I remember back in 2008, the triumphalism about, basically, a generation of Democratic hegemony, not just in Congress, but sort of ideologically as well. I remember shortly after Obama's election reading an article, I don't remember which newspaper, it was a major newspaper, about how from now on the Republicans were going to have to operate within a sort of a new liberal consensus. So they were going to have to, for example, drop their opposition to the science of climate change and instead, advocate market solutions to climate change, that kind of thing. So there was this kind of whole triumphalism about a new consensus. And I mean, in 2010, the Republicans won a huge landslide in the House of Representatives. I mean, the Democrats did not use their supermajority which was a quite fleeting one, 60 votes in the Senate and a majority in the House and a hugely popular president. They, very consciously, I think, did not wield that moment as a tool to, transform the financial system in particular, to transform the economy. I mean, they might have tried to do something like what FDR did in the 1930s, where they took kind of aim squarely at the, at the consensus that had produced, this calamity that was liquidating Americans' bank accounts and savings and mortgages and things like that. They might have used it as an opportunity to do all kinds of things. And they really didn't want to. And there are a variety of reasons for that. But the obsession with bipartisanship was certainly one of them. They felt that it was somehow more legitimate in a way. And Biden, who was vice president in those days, I think was a big part of this. It felt that it was more legitimate in some ways to have legislation passed with Republican support, which is a really fascinating sentiment, and one I don't think really find an analog to it on the right. Even to this day, you have figures like Nancy Pelosi saying, America needs a strong Republican Party and things like that. There's a fetish here, and this goes back to the West Wing again, for an idea of sort of intra-elite cooperation as an end in itself, and as something that is inherently good. So you have one side of the American political spectrum, which almost thinks about the country as a sort of ecosystem, and it thinks about its own role as kind of maintaining that ecosystem, and kind of dealing respectively with interlocutors on the other side. Republicans patently do not think that way, and despite the fact that republicanism and conservatism in many cases really is a minority proposition in the United States, they've been able to be quite effective in advancing an agenda by really being quite fiercely ideological. And, in many ways, the liberalism's kind of refusal to do the same, and it's kind of retreat from a politics which is able to really accommodate opposition at all, or kind of the idea of a political struggle towards an agenda. That's a big part of the story, I think, for why the Republican right has been on the march, and why it's also continued to enjoy political victories and political successes, even as in some ways its demands and its own kind of internal culture have just grown more and more removed from kind of the way a majority of Americans think and feel.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I mean, and you have an entire section of the book where you are talking about the media and just how they continue to get things wrong. I mean, like the idea of, you just in terms of like what you were talking about, inter-elite cooperation. Like that's what politics should be. The corporate media, for instance, never talks about the worker perspective in different conflicts. So like, you almost never see conflicts or coverage of worker strikes. I mean, like in the United States, we've had more strikes in the past, couple of years than we've had in decades in this country. And yet that story is basically never talked about, even in ostensibly liberal media outlets.
Yeah, I mean, I have to check the data on strikes. I think there's been a number of very high profile strikes. I'm not sure how it compares to recent years, but certainly the unions are much more visible and strikes are much more visible than they've been, and they're also more popular than they've been. I think it was Gallup had a poll just last year that found support for unions at something like 65%, which I think was the highest recorded since the early 1970s, something like that, or maybe it's the early 1980s. But certainly extremely high levels of support, even as union density continues to decline. But yeah, I mean, when it comes to the labor beat and kind of coverage of labor issues, I mean, the labor beat used to be a standard feature of newspapers. And so in the book, there's a review I wrote of a really, really good book, someone else's book, which is about it's called No Longer Newsworthy, and it's about kind of the erasure of the working class from the US media. And it's interesting. There are all kinds of reasons why, obvious reasons why working class issues and labor issues, have not been as visible, over the past 30 years. I mean, obviously, Reagan famously attacked the air traffic controllers, and there was a kind of, big turn of political power against trade unions and working class politics in general. But what's so interesting about this book, which is by a professor called Christopher Martin, is he also traces there are structural reasons for why we don't read about labor issues in the media. And a lot of it has to do with the way that the US medias and the media in general is really transformed. So it used to be the case that newspapers funded themselves in a big way through subscriptions, through just people going to newsstands and buying newspapers. So just, newspapers going into ordinary people's hands. And if you're trying to get as many newspapers out to people as you can, if you're trying to sell any product, really, you want to make the appeal of the product as broad as possible. And because, huge numbers of Americans are working class or middle class, the beats of a lot of reporting, it reflected that it really came through, and among other things, that's the reason why labor reporting used to be a much more kind of standard beat. Then a number of things happened. I mean, the cable news really took off, and then in the 90s with courtesy of Roger Ailes and others, partisan media really took off. So people discovered that you could actually make you could have a profitable media venture, not by targeting a broad audience, but by targeting individual ideological niches and then kind of stoking those niches as much as you could. And furthermore, newspapers also in many cases reoriented themselves. So they they started making a lot more money through ads. And so in their own way, they adopted a kind of niche market strategy where, for example, there's a friend of mine who used to be on the editorial board of a major newspaper here in Canada as kind of a token lefty. And he told me there that the explicit business strategy when he was there was that the newspaper was not really interested in readers who made less than $100,000 a year, which, is not a lot of people. You're targeting the top, few percentiles of income there, really. And yet you can have a profitable media venture and you just run ads that are for things of concern, and you run content that is of concern to people in those demographics. And a lot of people in those demographics are, managers, they're owners of businesses, things like that. And so again, the content reflects that. Coverage that might have once been about labor issues or the workplace becomes about here's how to manage your unruly workers. It becomes about HR. It becomes about
problem
things like
to
that.
solve. Yeah,
exactly. And so Christopher Martin, the author of the book, talks about once workers were appeared in kind of the U.S. media as kind of subjects, right, and as kind of autonomous, people, as members of the community, and increasingly they became kind of hailed as passive objects, I think is the phrase he uses. So they're people who are only kind of seen through the prism of management and things like that. So that's a very truncated kind of history, I suppose, of the realignment of the U.S. Media and of the media in general. But you can see how these changes just in really the business model of newspapers and cable news and things like that can really have a massive impact in the actual news people are reading and in the things it chooses to cover and not cover, and also in how it covers those things when it does.
Yeah. Well, and then also the news outlets originally, and this is true across the globe, that news outlets tended to be more locally owned and operated, locally financed by the readers and by the local advertisers. But then as they became conglomeratized into these national and international behemoths, the companies themselves, just because of who they had to please, who their financial backers were, that in the beginning it was the people predominantly that were paying the nickel for the newspaper or whatever, and so that was who the content was for, and that's what it was made for. But then as their overwhelming concern was about, well, I have to please my investors, so I have to keep the share price up, I have to continue to make profits. I mean, this whole idea that you must always be increasing your profit margin, like, it's a completely destructive notion and is very bad for business in the long term. The businesses that have that mentality, and they're in the United States now effectively required to have this mentality if they're a public company, like, this is destructive to your company in the long term. You cannot exist with a sane and stable set of values if that's what your overriding concern is. So many companies, whether it's IBM, like, it literally sold off, has become a totally different company than what it once was. And lots of companies that have managed to somehow survive over the decades, like, they're a shell of their former selves. They are not nearly as influential as they once were, and they've lost all kinds of revenue, and are not the icons that they originally wanted to be and were. And like, even in the case of like Facebook, that like the large tech companies now that exist, the highest value companies that exist now internationally, their workforces are like 1/100th of the size of the companies that used to exist at the top of the food chain.
Yeah, and that's certainly true of the media as well, where there you have there used to be many more jobs for just beat reporters and things like that, and it's a lot harder to work in the media than it used to. I mean, just a further example, further to what you were just saying, there's a very good documentary. This is not in the book, but it's relevant to the discussion. There's a very good documentary on Netflix about Boeing right now, which is, appears when you look at it, it looks like, okay, it's a documentary about these very high profile crashes that happen. recently. And of course, it is about these crashes, which were the result of the pilots not having been trained or even informed in this new system that was being installed, this kind of new navigation system whereby the plane would actually kind of adjust itself automatically in response, because in response to readings it was getting from a single sensor. So pilots flying these planes, even if they were very experienced, were not informed that this system even existed. And so you had these crashes that killed hundreds of people. But the reason the documentary is so good is because it actually traces this back to the Reagan era and to all the kind of corporate mergers that happened, to the broader climate of kind of financialization, a kind of zeal for public companies to constantly expand their profit margins. And, as a result of all of those things, all kinds of things about the company changed. Its HQ relocated to a different city so that it could be more removed from the engineers who were, inherently conservative and kind of, wanted to, were very risk averse. They didn't want to make planes that were going to kill people and that, had problems and things like that. But in this kind of relentless zeal for profit, all kinds of things go out the window, all kinds of kind of testing and just, we have a new system here. If we have to train all these pilots, that'll be really expensive. So let's just not, we won't even tell them that this new system even exists. So there's a clear through line there from the Reagan era and kind of the whole culture about profitability above all else and things like that, and having minimal regulation and letting the markets rip and all of that. There's a clear line from that all the way up to these horrific and completely avoidable crashes.
Yeah. Well, and one of the, I guess, sort of counter trends to all this consolidation and upward redistribution of content ideas and ownership there has been an emergence of an explicitly socialist media ecosystem in the past, I don't know, we'll say 7 years roughly. And of course there were, socialist publications and magazines, and you had Democracy Now!, which was socialist. So these things existed, but they didn't have a huge audience, and I'd say there's still, there's a lot of room to grow in that respect in terms of audience and awareness. But now there's something that exists, and you dedicated your book to Michael Brooks, who was a YouTuber and friend of yours, and one of the early socialist advocates as Web 2.0, I hate using that phrase, started emerging. But before he died, though, he wrote a book which I think it was it was an important book, but he died before he could really publicize it, and it sort of just faded away. But you wrote about it right after it came out, and didn't fit within the context of your anthology here. But I think it's worth talking about what he was talking about. So the book was, and I never got to know him, so unfortunately I can't really say anything about it. But the book basically is looking at the so-called intellectual dark web, and it's an important part of our ecosystem in the media now, because basically it's a way that it's just the latest way that the right has sort of packaged itself as, oh, well, see, we're transgressive too, we're against the fuddy-duddies, we're anti-establishment, and like this was something like I found there was this great hilarious New York Times article that I read in the 1990s, and it was right after, it was right when Laura Ingraham was first coming on the national political scene, and she and this other woman were wearing leopard print skirts, and it was the cover story of the New York Times magazine, and basically, and it was this long article about, yeah, see, we're not like these old conservatives, we like to have sex, because of course no conservatives have ever had sex in the entirety of human history, right? And we know how, we like popular culture and things like that. And it's like, this is the intellectual dark web is literally just a next version of this. And that was the subject of Brooks's book, and you wrote about it for Jacobin a while ago. Tell us about why did why was that such an important topic for you guys? Back when nobody had really cared about these people.
Sure. I
It
mean,
was
yeah,
2014, I guess, right?
well, yeah, I mean, Michael published his book, I think it was published in 2020, I think just a month or so before his untimely passing. But I wrote in 2014 about kind of the
Oh
new
yeah, I'm
atheist
sorry. Yeah.
movement, and that was in a piece that's probably still one of my best, my kind of most widely read pieces. I think I'd probably be somewhat embarrassed to read the prose now, but it having been about 8 years ago. You know, you change a lot as a writer in that kind of span of time. But yeah, I mean, I think there's some very obvious parallels between what calls itself the intellectual dark web and the new atheist movement, which I found myself quite drawn to as a teenager in some ways. You know, it was during the Bush era, because you know there was a whole story about. I mean, Bush was aligned obviously with the evangelical right, and so you know he's really their kind of voice in the White House, and so there's really a feeling that, you know, when you're attacking uh, religion broadly defined, there was something that was like encoded as liberal or progressive or you know transgressive is a word used about doing that. And you know, in my 2014 essay, I looked at the many ways in which a lot of really quite grotesque and in some cases bloodthirsty right wing politics were really laundered through this, you know, through these ideas, and how even you know, kind of quite people that exist in a kind of like liberal milieu, someone like Richard Dawkins, you know, who's famous for his writings about, you know, evolution and things like that, you know, would adopt these you know, through this kind of prism of new atheism, these really kind of chauvinist and racist positions, particularly though not exclusively towards you know, towards Muslims. You know, I think within the United States, there was also, it also fit very much into a kind of liberal conservative binary where, you know, there are liberals who really think of themselves as, you know, we're the smart ones. We live on the coasts and in all the places that have the culture, and religion is something for the primitives that live, you know, in the South and in the hinterland and things like that. And so there was a certain kind of, you know, kind of class politics to it as well, a kind of class chauvinism. Michael's book took on the intellectual dark web, which I believe the phrase was introduced in that sort of lengthy New York Times piece a few years ago that was, I believe, written by Barry Weiss. And it, you know, introduced a number of these figures. Jordan Peterson was one of them. You know, Ben Shapiro.
Joe
You know,
Rogan was there too, actually.
Joe Rogan, figures who, you know, in some cases anyway, are quite explicitly right wing politics. I mean, if you don't think Ben Shapiro or you know, Jordan Peterson are right wing, I mean, it's hard to continue the discussion, but I mean, what was useful about that framing, and I think what was very flattering to this kind of group of people, is that it really positioned them as these sort of, I think, non-tribal thinkers was the phrase that was used in the piece. And of course, yeah, when you look at this this ecosystem, insofar as there is one, it really is, you know, and Michael's book goes through you know, different incarnations of it. There's kind of a chapter on Jordan Peterson. There's one on Ben Shapiro, etc. And you know, he shows how they all have kind of quite explicitly right wing and reactionary views of the world, but also how, you know, their story, the story they tell about the world, the stories they tell about the world really are kind of myths. They're fables. You know, they are. You know, Ben Shapiro, for example, has this kind of ludicrous idea he's advanced in his book. I mean, it's an idea that would, like, you'd fail it if you submitted it as an undergraduate paper somewhere. This idea that, you know, the United States represents this perfect coming together of like the two competing strands in the Western philosophical tradition, you know, Athens and Jerusalem, you know. And so, you know, if you know, if you have any kind of knowledge of history or any sense of kind of if you've read Western philosophy at all, I mean, you know that this is just kind of made up. But you know, it's,
Well, and it's
if you want to,
also it's also a contradiction of the narrative that American conservatives tell themselves, which is that this is a Judeo-Christian country. So like, it's a complete rejection of the things that they actually tell themselves. Like, they don't believe in a Athens Jerusalem fusion. Like they don't believe that. They believe, no, this is a Christian nation for Christians, and all those homosexual Greeks can go fuck themselves. Like that's what they actually believe.
I mean, this is one of the reasons why, this style of, the kind of intellectual dark web style of political argument is useful, because a lot of it is not encoded for everybody as sort of right wing. Jordan Peterson, for example, where I hear him brought up most is, I watch a lot of like YouTube, like fitness videos, like, kind of like really muscly guys that tell you how to get jacked and that kind of thing. And a lot of those guys are really into Jordan Peterson, and they don't even regard him as a political thinker in a lot of cases. Like he's not somebody, they see him more as like a self-help guy who kind of helps you sort out, the chaotic world and kind of orient yourself more constructively towards it. And, in Michael's book, as he does kind of throughout, there's a chapter on Jordan Peterson where he really gets it, how Jordan Peterson's project fundamentally is just the standard right-wing defense of hierarchy is something that's natural and organic. Inequality is something that is kind of an ineffable feature of human nature and is in some ways rooted in, nature itself, that kind of thing. Michael was very good on those subjects, but I think also importantly, he was able to discuss them because he was himself able to discuss them effectively, because he was himself kind of such an open-minded and intellectually generous and funny guy. And when he died, Jacobin published I think a number of there were so many kind of warm tributes that came in from just people who listened to his show, and what a lot of them said is that he actually kind of moved them to the left after they'd been immersed in right-wing YouTube and things like that. I mean, he was able, I think, he represented the best of the left in that way, and that I think he was able to kind of speak to people who weren't, hadn't already kind of absorbed a lot of the, the usual, the usual beliefs or language or things like that. And I think, in many ways, that's Michael's most important legacy beyond anything that he actually wrote, was just the kind of approach that he brought to his broadcasting and to his writing. I think it's really invaluable, and I think one of the reasons I felt like dedicating the book to him was because I think that the only way we're going to continue to build up the political left and kind of win more converts to it is by adopting something like that approach.
Yeah, well, and to be willing to engage and to seek engagement, because I mean, the reality is that as much as these so-called self-proclaimed free thinkers, non-tribal thinkers, they don't actually want to debate anyone. Like they never have guests who disagree with them on their shows. Like if you're Brett Weinstein or Eric Weinstein, like they would die before they would have someone on their show who was like, well, you know what, vaccines are good. And this nonsense about hydroxychloroquine, you can just throw it in the trash, and here's 100 reasons why. Like they will never have these debates. But the thing is, like for a lot of people especially who are young and just getting interested in politics, like they don't know that these people don't know anything. I mean, like the only people that Ben Shapiro can debate is 19-year-old college freshman. Like that's the caliber of his intellect. And that's who he only wants to debate. Like he runs from debate with other people, and and then the same. I mean, and Joe Rogan is willing to at least somewhat talk to people, but he still is afraid of people who he thinks are mean. So like he said that he thinks Sam Cedar is mean, and so he won't have him on his show. And like, but you have to point that out. If you have a leftist or a socialist or whatever you want to call yourself perspective, you need to say, look, the facts actually are on our side, and I will discuss them with you. But don't, you can't respond by, if all you're going to do is troll, then that shows you have no confidence or intellect.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think leftists in general should be more comfortable debating right-wing interlocutors, because we should be confident in our arguments. Our arguments, I think, by and large, are pretty good. I think in 2020, some point, during coronavirus, I can't remember, I debated a libertarian, in one of these kind of extremely broad, socialism versus capitalism kind of debates. And and he was a nice guy. It wasn't a particularly, hostile debate or anything like that. But I find that kind of exercise very useful. I think it helps you clarify your own ideas, and I also think it helps you instill for deepen your own confidence in your own arguments and your ideas. It certainly contributed to my feeling that kind of the libertarian analysis that he was doing is just very flawed, and it can't withstand arguments. And I think while we should try to avoid there is a tendency, some people have an instinct to just I don't think you can treat everybody like a reasonable interlocutor. So, for example, I don't think that there's any point. There's no point debating, a fascist or something like that. You're not going to find some sensible, middle ground with someone like that. But people that have right wing politics, even if they're going to be very hostile to you, like a Ben Shapiro or something, I don't think their arguments can stand up to scrutiny. And that's one of the reasons why, as you said, Ben Shapiro, a lot of his appeal is that he, from an elevated platform on a stage with a microphone in his hand, will, yell at an 18-year-old college student or something like that, and that's debate. He'll inflict his incredibly tedious, logic nerd bullshit on whoever's in the crowd or whatever, and that's because his arguments can't stand up to scrutiny.
Yeah, well, and but at the same time, I can see why some people would feel like, well, I shouldn't have to debate my existence. So, like, if you're transgender,
Yeah,
or
absolutely.
and so but if that's and that's a perfectly valid perspective. But at the same time, you do need to understand that, like, the way that the battle for same-sex marriage, marriage equality, that was won by having these debates, even though that some people don't want to do them, and you don't have to do them if you don't want to. But for somebody who does want to do them, you shouldn't begrudge them for doing that. That is one of the other subjects that we're going to be talking about on this show, is that when you look at, I mean, you have to think about, like, the idea of same-sex marriage. It went from completely controversial, an offensive idea, and it went to reality in so many countries across the globe in, depending on overall, let's say like 20 years. That's a subject you should be studying. I think, if you really want to be building change, is looking at how they did it. And they did it by, I mean, obviously they had a huge advantage in that everybody knows at least someone who is, gay or lesbian, generally speaking, statistically. But at the same time, being able to tell a story and come out of the closet and say, look, I'm a gay man, I'm a lesbian woman, I am a normal person, I do not molest children. You know me, you need to know that I'm normal, and I'm your friend, or I'm your family member, or whatever. Like, telling the story, the personal aspect of it, and showing people that all these lies that they had heard about them, whether from their churches or political parties or whatever, that they were lies, and just having them confront their own experience and applying it to a broader perspective. Like, that's how you do it.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add there, but certainly.
Yeah. All right. Well, so I guess the other, I guess before we wrap up here, let's maybe just talk a little bit about Jacobin for those who are not familiar with it. So what is it, and how? I guess that's where you're writing most of your stuff nowadays, right? You're a staff writer.
That's right. And yeah, the majority of the essays in the book were originally written for Jacobin. I should say there are some original material in the book as well. There are essays that were published in Current Affairs and The Atlantic also. So it's not all Jacobin essays, but yeah, by and large, most of the essays were originally written for Jacobin, where I've been working since November of 2018. Although I wrote my first Jacobin essay, I think, in 2014. So I had I was writing for them for a while, and yeah, I mean, Jacobin is the most successful socialist magazine. I think probably fair to say the most widely read socialist magazine in the English-speaking world, and the most successful thing of its kind for decades and decades, if not possibly ever, at least in an American context. It also has a pretty extensive global network. There's a Jacobin Latin America, Jacobin Brazil, Jacobin Germany, Jacobin Italy. There's Tribune, which is an older socialist publication in Britain, which has been kind of relaunched and is part of the wider Jacobin network. George Orwell, lots of famous people wrote for Tribune. It's very quickly built up an audience in the UK as well. And I may be forgetting some Jacobin affiliates. The point is, there's quite a few of them, and the essays are published in English and also in a whole bunch of other languages. But yeah, broadly speaking, it's a kind of an ecumenical publication. A lot does publish a lot of academics, but also organizers and students and activists as well. I think if I was to compare Jacobin to the kinds of magazines that I was reading when I was 14 or 15, I think there are a number of differences that are quite striking. When I was 14 or 15, I read the magazine Adbusters a lot, which I'm not sure if people will remember that, but this was sort of a you could say lefty-ish sort of. Pardon?
Ralph Nader was the progenitor of it, I believe, wasn't he? Or he was involved with it in some fashion.
I'm if so, I'm unaware of that. But Adbusters was it was very sort of zine-like. It was very dour. It had a lot of very sort of dark colors in it. Its politics, I think, were a little bit free-floating in some ways. I mean, it was, yeah, I suppose broadly sort of anti-establishment, but and anti-corporate. But often, I think it's kind of a lot of the ideas that it was advocating were a little bit, in retrospect, incomplete, to say the least. So, we were going to do culture jamming. We were going to like have the Nike logo and have, blood dripping from it, and, things like that. It was kind of all over the map, and its sensibility, I think, overall was just a little, it felt quite pessimistic in some ways. And I think, if you open up a copy of Jacobin, one of the first things you'll notice is how kind of vibrant the colors are, and how kind of dynamic the design is. And while some people might say that there's no, good aesthetics are distinct from good ideology, I do think there's a relationship between these two things as far as Jacobin's concerned. I mean, I do think it has been one of the kind of main intellectual homes of this remarkable flourishing of democratic socialist ideas among people under 40 and beyond as well, of course. It's been, I think, the publication most closely aligned with Bernie Sanders in both of his presidential runs. I think we like to think of it as much more accessible than some left publications have traditionally been, while also able to be intellectually serious and kind of credible as a media source, obviously. And so yeah, it's a place where it's kind of been my main home as a writer for the past several years, and it has in some ways kind of been the laboratory in which I've kind of workshopped a lot of my my recent ideas about politics and kind of the themes that are going to be in this book.
Okay, yeah. Well, and that's jacobin.org, jacobin.org, for those who haven't checked it out yet. And the other thing, I guess, also is that, and you talked about it just for a sec, is that the idea of bringing, so, the weird thing about socialism or leftism in I'd say the global context is that it's become heavily academicized. And so largely inscrutable and out of touch with the average person, the people that they want to represent, but they can't speak to them in a coherent fashion that doesn't involve, verbal footnotes almost.
Yeah, I mean, one of the consequences of one of the things that came out of the 1990s is, you had political parties that at least had, roots in the, working classes of their countries, really quite aggressively moving away from, really moving towards, and is especially true of the Democrats, right? Moving towards a much more kind of affluent and suburban kind of constituency. And at the same time, you had, traditional left-wing institutions like trade unions being kind of battered, and also a lot of the industries where there had been high levels of private sector union workers in particular, were really in decline, particularly vis-a-vis manufacturing. And as a result, you kind of come out of that period with all those developments I just mentioned, and yeah, there is certainly a risk that you end up with a left that is much more sort of, it skews towards a much more sort of middle class constituency than the one it's trying to organize and be in solidarity with, where you have oftentimes an over professionalized left that's I'm not this is not a criticism of nonprofits per se, but I think it's very much the case that we have a lot of nonprofits and kind of professional activism, which now kind of takes the place of a much more kind of organic and bottom up style political activism and advocacy that used to exist. All that's obviously a very kind of generalized statement. And one of the challenges for, if we're talking about kind of millennial socialism and things like that, one of the challenges is that I think this can be overstated, so I don't want to I don't want to lay this on too thick, but I think it's certainly a real phenomenon that you have a lot of younger people under, which is to say people under 40, who are downwardly mobile. They're not particularly well off. They're certainly not middle class in the sense that would have been understood 25, 30, 40 years ago. But they have university degrees. They often live in major cities, that kind of thing. And so obviously we need to build a left that has substantial constituencies outside of that. We can't we're not going to build a different kind of society, a better society, or even make progress within this current one in a meaningful way with just downwardly mobile, economically anxious, people under 40. I mean, this kind of demographics is destiny idea that you alluded to earlier, in response to the coming Democratic majority book, and how you say it was misread. I mean, we absolutely can't count on anything like that. We can't count on, you can't just look at polls that show younger people to be politically progressive and hope that 10 years down the line that's going to fix climate change, or that's going to take us towards a more equal society, or anything like that. All of that is going to require organization, political education, advocacy, agitation. It's going to require a lot more disruptive political campaigns, like the Sanders campaigns and like some of the campaigns they've inspired at the congressional level. It's going to take a lot more hard and fast victories in the political sphere. Not just waiting around for for the kids to save us on TikTok or whatever it is.
Yeah. Well, no, I 100% agree. That's all great stuff. All right. Well, I appreciate you being here today, Luke. Let me just put up the book one more time on the screen here. So it's The Dead Center: Reflections on Liberalism and Democracy After the End of History. So thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. And yeah, thanks for your interest in the book. People can, it's still available for pre-order. So if you pre-order it now from orbooks.com, orbooks.com, that is, you can get 15% off.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, I'm just going to give a little wrap up here, and then if you can stick around just for a sec.
Sure.
That'd be great. Okay. All right. Well, so that's our program for today, and glad you were able to be with me here. So just to remind everybody that Theory of Change is part of the Flux Media Network. And you can check out the website at flux.community. We've got all kinds of articles and podcasts. And we try to look at religion, politics, media, and technology and how they all intersect with each other. So please do check that out. And you can support us at patreon.com/discoverflux. And then if you want to go in directly to the Theory of Change archives on the Flux site, you can just go to theoryofchange.show, and that will take you right where you need to go with that. So thank you for being here today. I'm Matthew Sheffield, and we'll see you next time.